A common phrase in the fellowship of folks practicing the spirituality recovery is we discover God's doing for us what we couldn't do for ourselves, and that really comes out of the point of departure from our old ways, where we enter into recovery, and that's discovering that we're powerless and admitting that we're powerless, and that seems to be probably the primary hurdle over. It's the embracing of the truth. It's the giving up. We had a discussion this morning about releasing my demands on God's creation. Releasing my demand that things be other than what they are. And my addictive response to the world as it was, my inability to live life on life's terms, to accept, my place in God's world. My response and my solution to that was to escape. When I encountered situations or circumstances or relationships that were unacceptable to me. And alcohol was immediate and effective. Just by a few cocktails, without that required no investment into vulnerability and risk on my part. I could be transported to another situation or circumstance without even leaving the room, and without leaving the presence of the other person, in a material sense. But actually, well, certainly the effect wasn't material, but a casual observer might not know that. In fact, I was such a high-functioning alcoholic that I could perform under the influence in a way that most people unless you really knew me, wouldn't know that I was affected. And so I became a master manipulator of the unacceptable. I would change, I would alter my personality, I would alter my view of the world by the way I used alcohol. And therefore, the things that I found unacceptable I'd either have the courage to change or influence or demand some kind of a response from, or I would be so anesthetized that whatever it was that was provoking the disturbance in me would be numbed. I would enjoy the temporary relief that the oblivion alcohol afforded me, gave me. So then, that was a progressive response to my environment that I, by cultural standards, was successful in. It was a successful management strategy. The idea that I was powerless was very foreign to my ability to perform in this culture. And I was getting promoted in a major aerospace company every other year, getting performance awards, reinforcing this idea I had that I was righteous, I had it figured out, and the world around me that rebelled against my behavior in response to it was the fundamental problem.
Winning.
I was winning. Except that there was this, what I recognize now as a God-given desire that's fundamentally programmed into our very being. And now, being at seminary, I discover it was the created order, is that we should be co-creators with God. And the creation may be finished, but it's not done yet. It always will be emerging, as it's God's nature to create, and us created in His image is to co-create with Him. And so this desire that I had for more, this desire to have meaning in my life and to create beauty and to be in community, the way I was responding to the world alienated me from, made that inaccessible to me. And one day in a moment of revelation, that became very clear to me, that my very heart's desire was unacceptable because my strategy was to remove myself from situations that I couldn't accept. I couldn't agree with. I couldn't find a way to sit with the things that created that I was when I was in pain.
That sounds sustainable.
It sounds sustainable?
Doesn't it? You just get rid of that stuff that's not working, keep going, go in.
Well, my measures of success, what I thought was nutritious turned out not to have any vitamins for me. It didn't satisfy that ingrained God-given desire, which is at the heart of my being. And what was held up to me was that something I had declared in my adolescence, one of those moments of clarity where you encounter the truth and there's no argument, everything in you agrees with it, was something like a statement I shared with some of my friends. The measure of the substance of a person's worth in this life is revealed in the nature of the relationships they have with others. And that moment of truth for me when I was about 46 was that everything that I declared to hold priceless and on which I invested my self-worth was toxic, and alcohol was at the center of it. And so that led to the discovery that I couldn't manipulate that into another version of the truth. That was the truth, and I had no plan B for substituting. I had no coping strategy or a management plan that would backfill my giving up the alcohol. And it was a sequence of events and waypoints along the way where I had some encounters that were held up to me with others. For example, a few years earlier, a total stranger had come up to me at a coffee hour at church and said, in the course of the conversation about the weather, suddenly he says something like, in a couple days I'll have 12 years clean and sober. And my thinking was, who in their right mind would share that with a total stranger? And yet, when the moment of truth came for me, and I was powerless, that encounter came into my consciousness, and he's the one I called for help, and I got help, and I entered into community, and that was my introduction to the 12 steps and the spiritual program there. So embracing that, overcoming the hurdle of that shame, which I have since discovered was at the heart of why alcohol was such a perfect solution to my discomfort in living. The shame had always been resident. I inherited that, when I entered this world. The hurdle to getting over being confronted, accepting my powerlessness, opened the door into entering into a way of seeing the world that was inaccessible to me until I passed through that. And that was the whole sequence of these series of practicing the principles of the 12 steps. And a lot of people on the outside that aren't familiar with them may think it's like a brownie recipe. And they say, well, that program doesn't work for me, or it didn't work for my son, or, that we followed the steps and the recipe and the brownies didn't come out of the oven, the way we expected. Well, the 12 steps aren't like that. They're like reorienting myself in such a way that I get in right relationship with my Creator. I am just a creature. And finding the willingness to accept that, to find that acceptable, that I'm powerless, but there is a power greater than myself. And accepting that makes that power available to me. And so when I then become willing to turn my life over to the care of that God, again, there's another acceptance threshold that reorients me and opens up an aspect of God's creation that was unavailable to me before. So I'm entering into, and I think of scripturally now this idea of Jesus going to these disciples, these fishermen and these misfits, these ragamuffins, and saying, "Come, follow me." This to me now resonates with God saying, "Phil, just follow me. Turn your life over to my care. Accept this kind of love." And so I entered into that, and the pain started to lift. This sense of I don't understand this, but being embraced by the loving arms of God, as I am. My worst shame is what may even make me lovable and capable of loving others. And all that other stuff that was a counterfeit that I had achieved in my cultural standards had looked like a measure of success is the stuff that when I'm gone will disappear, will rust and fade away, and it means nothing. My mess is that which God will make His message to the world. And then I open up scriptures and look through that lens and I see, well, every story in that salvation history is structured that way, right? So now the willingness gets strengthened in me to accept things which previously I'd found unacceptable, and every day I'm encountering things like that. So now I'll talk a little bit about specifically situations. Since I'm cooperating with the divine reveals to me He's always been right there waiting for me to have conversation. And life does not become a happily ever after. That was an expectation I put upon God's creation. I let go of that and found that practicing the principles is not following the path of least resistance. It means that in our God is a God who loves us and is willing to suffer with us. And so 2 years into sobriety, I have a heart attack. That is well, let me back up a little bit. 2 weeks. One day, 2 years into recovery, I walk into the sanctuary of my church and I have an audible affirmation of the divine saying, Philip, there's absolutely nothing that could ever separate you from my love. And it was spoken to every cell of my being. And it spoke to me in a way that transcended time. It was not transactional. This is the way it's always been. It was a revelation of this is the kind of love that I have. And it's always been this way. And so I felt free from the sins and the burden of the stuff that I was making amends for. And 2 weeks later, and I will never leave you comfortless. 2 weeks later, on a holiday weekend in the middle of nowhere on the eastern shore of Virginia, I began to have chest discomfort, and an alcoholic debate begins in my mind about it could be my heart. Maybe I should call the ambulance. Don't be ridiculous if it's just heartburn. You'll look like a fool. And then this conversational presence of God says, Phil, in AA you're taught to ask for help. So I'm encountering this willingness to accept the situation that's beyond my control, and having no guarantee of what's going to happen next. Embrace it. And here is the re-experiencing of what I'd encountered 2 weeks prior. I would never leave you comfortless. And now it's not about the past. It's not about all that has been. It's about this moment, this present moment. I'm with you and I am with you in the present. And I had an incredibly supersensory experience of a satellite view of the strip of land I was on the eastern shore, and what was going on inside my body. The peacefulness that I was in the midst of confronting my mortality was just divine. It was grace. It was not something I manufactured by willpower or even by surrender. It was an otherness. It was God's grace overtook me. I even was aware of my sister when I asked her to call 911 going in the house, and in her anxiety I was aware of as she put the coffee pot on the stove and lit a cigarette and the smoke went into her lungs. And me being willing to ask for help in that circumstance saved my life. So shortly thereafter, I knew I'm here. Now the truth is, and we say this like abstract ideas, and it's repeated, and it had been in my DNA forever, but not in my understanding or acceptance of it. It was an idea, was that our life is never our own. That it's only by God's grace do I exist. So I pray and say, okay, so God, you chose for me to stay. What is it that I'm missing? And He says, my gift to you in this life. I am with you in this moment, in this present moment. And And I start to discover that the things that God is speaking to me are the things that God has always spoken, the things he's speaking to other people. Eckhart Tolle wrote a book at the same time I'm sharing this experience, The Power of Now. And so these are not special, interpretive, kind of one-on-one, aren't I special because God's speaking to me kinds of things. This is the nature of God that pervades our existence. And so I'm starting to accept what we'd always been taught. And then a couple of years later, now, as I'm realizing my life is not my own, never has been, God is with me, ever present, I'm in a holy space, a space where I should be as safe as I can ever be. It's a healing service. We do a Eucharist, and our tradition in this service is to kneel at the altar and receive communion, and as we receive, the folks who have received the body of Christ will lay hands on one another and pray for each other. And a black woman comes into the church that I've never seen before and somehow recognizes Pastor Annie. It comes time for Eucharist. I kneel at the altar next to Pastor Annie. She starts twitching and grunting and, oh, Jesus, oh. And I think to myself, and I'm ashamed to say it, but here it is. That's what they do. I think a black Pentecostal or gospel charismatic, I have a prejudice or a worldview I didn't even realize I had. So I think that's what they do in skepticism. And then again, the divine encounters me because I'm open to accepting things that defy my understanding. And he says, what do you think you're unique? Don't you think it's possible that what you're witnessing is her response to my presence with her? And suddenly I'm opened up to, the divine reality of the community of believers. And he's not just ever present with me, he's ever present with us. And this is the experience in the 12 steps, the fellowship of the body. And he says, meet your sister. And I think we're all brothers and sisters. And it's a head knowledge. And he says, this is your eternal sister. Tell her I love her. And I have this skepticism rise in me, and he says, why don't you choose to believe? And this is the crunch time, because he spoke that right into the heart of my being. Why don't you choose to believe? Now, I've thought I believed. I'd had personal encounters, a personal relationship with Christ. He had revealed himself. I'd embraced those encounters as if I now understood God. And when he posed this question, why don't you choose to believe? It wasn't about believe just this that I was experiencing with her next to me. It was about choose to believe that I'm so infinitely more than you can ever stuff into your small imagination. The kind of belief that's going to require you to abandon everything you think you know. And terror came up in me I didn't know was there. There's stuff that I was hanging on to, apparently, to orient myself to God and to people around me, that I was so attached to. I discovered an unwillingness to let go. So for me to receive the total love of God, the total, what he wanted to reveal to me and be useful and obedient to his call on me, I had to let go of stuff that I discovered I wasn't so willing to let go of. And I was afraid to let go of. But then it's like, but Phil, this is that loving God who is with you in that moment of the heart attack. This is that loving God who's revealed himself as love. So your defiance, you're holding back from that, is keeping you from access to that love. And I don't know how I did it, Travis, but it was like flipping a light switch, and I fell into the loving arms of God. And I went to another world. He says, tell her I love her. And I opened my mouth, and this most beautiful music came out of me. He said, get closer. I wanted to feel my breath on her. And when I got closer, I felt the breath wash off of her and pour over me. You see, it wasn't me mustering enough belief. It wasn't me exercising some faith or idea of anything that I could do in my person. It was my willingness to accept that God is infinitely more than I can ever understand. His love is infinitely more capable of overcoming anything I could do to I mean, even hanging him on a tree, you know. And now, you know, this idea of a resurrection, this idea of a Son of God who would die for me, that kind of love that forgives me even while I'm killing it, you know, just took over every cell of my being. And not only me, but it poured out into those around me, and everybody was speaking in the kingdom language. So that moment passed, and yet that memory never will. And here I still am, and I still get my mind out in front of things, and I still encounter situations that I'm inclined to immediately solve with the good mind that God gave me, and I forget to ask Him, you know, first. I was hospitalized recently because I had a water main break, and I started to analyze all my options about how to fix the problem, and the best solution I could come up with was to dig the hole myself. I get hospitalized, and then overnight, because I have heart issues, I've got to, you know, listen to that, and all the bells and whistles, all the tests, and I set a track record on the treadmill. God puts me in a room where they do the stress test, and I mean, He's got a sense of humor. There's a young gal that's prepping me who's got 30 days clean and sober, I discovered while she's prepping me. And then the woman comes in to do the test, and while she's doing the test, I'm carrying on a conversation about her son who has not found sobriety yet and is killing himself. And so that the mess that I made in my life, that God's redeemed, now my darkness becomes the light in their darkness by the grace of God. And they find nothing wrong with me, and I say, God, what's that all about? Was I not supposed to dig that hole? And He says, no, of course you're supposed to dig the hole. He says, but you didn't ask me first, you know. So I got to accept that, you know, God's in charge of everything, and that if I'm really to be in the relationship that He so desires, I've got to turn to Him for even the mundane and even the practical. And that takes a lot of practice, because everything in me is programmed to do exactly the opposite. And so here I am. I'm going to seminary 3,000 miles from home. God laid it on my heart to bring back to my church what He revealed to me in recovery. You know, I've seen lives experiencing the resurrection that I read about in the book. They don't even, you know, who healed you, and they say, I don't know, just like that guy by the pool in scriptures. And I don't know what that career looks like. I can see about this far, and I'm learning how to accept that it's not management by objectives, seeing over the horizon and then lining up all the wickets along the way. It's flying blind by the seat of my pants, and that's the way I would have it, because it forces me to say, God, what next? You know, what next? And it terrifies me, because it's not this teaching about, you know, God calls you to do what you're gifted and what comes naturally to you. I think for me, that's not the way God works. What God does is He says, you got nothing without me. And maybe it's just my willful defiance. He's going to call me to do something that I can't do with His help. He says, no, you're a special case, I guess. I'm going to call you to do something you could never do. You could never even imagine doing, because I need you I want you to totally rely on me. And if you think you can do it with my help, you're apt to forget that part. So I walk around in fear. Anxiety comes upon me. I try to be obedient, and I've got shame-based stuff that tells me I'm not good enough still. And it's a lot of mindfulness and staying awake and exercising in community and putting people around me to help me remember that it's not about me. I'm not alone, and I need to, for me to thrive and realize the potential of who God created Phil to be. I need to be part of a community. I need to be hardwired into the divine, and just have unbroken, constant contact. So And I'm not only willing to accept that, I don't ever want to lose sight of that.